Hi, and welcome to week 6 of environmental law. This week, we are going to be talking about some kind of interesting little items that I didn't, when I used another textbook, they didn't really cover this. So it was kind of fun for me to go through that. But talking about the real local level of laws, right? Zoning and planning, local zoning and planning issues, because everything starts locally. And talking just some terms that maybe if you've had any real estate law might be familiar to you. And yeah, so then we're going from local to we're exploding into global, talking about international law um, with relations to environmental concerns. And then I'm going to bump into climate change. And we will have, and that's not in the textbook. This is kind of side stuff. The textbook's a little bit older, so some of the stuff is newer. So it's different stuff, but kind of talking about like our past three presidents, their approaches to climate change, and how we have progressed or not progressed uh, to aid in the stop of global warming. So that we're kind of going from the uh, the seed to the oak today. Okay, so to start with zoning, so zoning and sustainability. So every municipality, township, county, right? They have their own zoning rules, and the zoning comes from their plan for how their town or village or city is going to be laid out. So these are the building blocks of environmental regulation, right? We can say, oh, well, this is going to be set aside for parkland, this is our commercial zone, this is where our factories are going, this is where our homes are going, all of that stuff. So the town itself can regulate, what uses are going to be in certain areas of the town. And if it's done carefully, um, the proper zoning can work towards that balance of promoting development and economic interest, and addressing environmental concerns. So the term sustainable development, that is development that meets our needs and then preserves our resources and our ecosystems for future generations, right? So we're not going to, pollute all our rivers or mine all our natural resources. We are going to develop in a sustainable way. So, you're trying to control or limit the environmental footprint of any new development. So it's kind of interesting now. And if you're like an engineer or an environmental engineer these days, there's all sorts of like wonderful things that can be done when building. Okay, so when when I visited New York the last time, I went to Hudson Yards, which is a new development in New York City on the west side along the river. It's actually built over railroad tracks. And they have kind of an observation tower, which is pretty cool. And you can hang out there and, have a glass of wine and look at the beautiful view. But on your way up to this observation tower, they give you a little video of and boards and information on how this is an eco-friendly development. Okay, so in the Hudson Yards, they have two, well, they're calling them cogeneration plants. So two power plants that are eco-friendly, and those they generate electricity. And then if any heat that is given off by those engines or engines um, is recycled to heat and cool the buildings in the area. And they, this process reduces greenhouse gas emissions by 25,000 metric tons of CO2 each year. They're self-sustaining, right? So they power themselves. They're not going off of some city grid, which would be more transport of this energy. And traditionally, some of this stuff was dirtier. The fuels were dirtier than we're using now. I also attached, and you can look at this at your leisure in the supplemental materials, something that I just read this morning in the New York Times about another building right over by Grand Central Station, which was built, it was called like One Vanderbilt Place or something, that was built to be, very eco-friendly and sustainable. It recycles the water, the rainwater, and they use that as part of their, their hot water heating and cool water heating. And again, they have their own power plants. But interestingly enough, just in the time that it took for that building to go up, our concept of a green building changed. And they may not be up to what is going to be expected from buildings in the future. So yeah, it's a good read. I apologize. It was in the New York Times Magazine, I think last Sunday, and there were a lot of pictures and things. But when I tried to upload the PDF with the pictures, it it was too big, so I just copied and pasted out the text and attached that in the supplemental materials. But so, just examples of sustainable development, just these well, Hudson Yards isn't a building, it's a kind of a development. And that one Vanderbilt where architects, developers are trying to make buildings more sustainable. So a term that you may or may not have heard of already is environmental footprint. We talk about our carbon footprint, right? The measure of what we're doing and how that impacts nature, right? You can, I also have the link here, and it's also in the supplemental materials to the EPA's carbon footprint calculator. We've all talked about this or amongst ourselves or read about it or heard about it. What are we doing to reduce our carbon footprint? Are we driving less? Are we driving an electric car? Are we keeping our fuel bills? Are we recycling? All of that. So the environmental footprint is technically, how much land and resources are needed to support a population's needs, right? Places to live, food and water, and how much are we using without giving it back. The United States, their footprint versus some less developed nations is much higher, as probably can be expected. So for fun, or for, when you go there, they can say, oh, what are things you can do to reduce your carbon footprint? It's a nice little tool. And again, it's in the supplemental materials as well, if you don't have the PowerPoint up with the link for yourselves. Okay, so talking about sustainability and zoning, we want sustainable development, and maybe one of the tools that can be used is zoning. So zoning is like a municipality. They divide it into districts, right? So you might have a residential district, you might have a commercial district, you might have an industrial district, you might have parkland. And the power to zone, remember we talked about this with the Constitution, right? That there's laws that there's powers that have to be granted from somewhere. Okay, so these are states, or lower than states, but the zoning power has to come somehow from a state constitution or statute, and it will because what it does is it limits an owner's right to do what they want with the property, right? So if I am in a residential district and I want to, open my froyo store, out of my first floor, I can't do that because I'm zoned differently. Okay, so it limits what an owner wants to do. So the rules related to zoning, the standards are they must, obviously match the powers granted from the state constitution or statute, and they must be reasonable and done to serve the public health. Now, I don't know if you remember back to where we were thinking about where states get the right to enact environmental laws, in the federal area or arena, it is the Commerce Clause, but in state laws, it's that the police power to serve the public health and welfare. So they have to be within that limitation. Um, so usually incompatible uses are kept separately, right? So you have commercial areas different from residential areas or industrial areas and parkland. So that's one of the things. They have certain zones. They might regulate how high you can build. If you need to have parking for, if you build an apartment building, you can't just not have parking. Um, they have lot sizes, and they might have allocations for easements. Now, easements is a property term. I think it's on the quiz, so think about this. So an easement is, I technically own this land, but I am granting someone a right to use my land for a certain purpose. So, uh, I grant, the power company an easement to go and read my meter. They don't do it that way anymore, but back in the day, they used to go around to people's backyards and read your meter for your water or your power. Now it's all electronic and they just drive by. But that's an example of an easement. They have a legal right to be on my property to read the meter. Sometimes there are like air easements, so that I have a right that nobody builds in front of me. Sometimes, or another easement would be like to access the power lines if you had power lines in your backyard, and there's a power company would have an easement to go and in your yard and work on the power lines or trim trees around the power lines. Um, Sometimes, if you have a piece of land that you're kind of landlocked, you might have an easement from another property owner to get through, to walk through, or have a driveway through their yard to access your yard. So that's what an easement is. It's a right to use the property a legal right to use the property that you technically do not own. The concepts of zoning is newer. It didn't really exist until the 20th century. Before that, people just built what they want where they wanted it. New York City's first zoning ordinance was 1916. So, it's a long time ago, but it's not that long ago. Some places still don't have zoning rules. Smaller towns and cities might not have had the necessity for that yet. But if I, say I want to open my froyo stand out of my first floor and I want to use that land and it's not zoned for that, I have to go to the town and request what's called a variance. You probably have seen signs, variance requested. Somebody wants to use this for a non-zoned purpose. So, depending upon where you are, there's a process that you apply for a variance. There is, probably a board that reviews it. Sometimes they actually have little town meetings if it's a big thing to see how the community feels about this variance. Every municipality, township, whatever, has their own process for variances. Okay, here's that. We were talking about we need an empowerment statute for zoning. For those of you who maybe cannot see this, the statute is 65 ILCS, Illinois Compiled Statutes 5/1-1-13-1. And this is just really it goes on after this little paragraph, and you can check it out on your own. But things that they're saying: adequate light, pure air, safety from fire and other dangers, taxable value of land may be conserved, congestion in public streets may be lessened, um, damage to property from runoff, architectural and aesthetic importance, whatever. So then, because of all of these reasons, there's a bunch, right? Really, the health and welfare of the people and the area, the municipality has the power to create their own zoning. So that is, an Illinois statute. It's not in the Illinois Constitution. Okay, so we have our zoning, and there are different uses for your different zoned area. Okay, so a permitted use would be a use identified in the zoning district. So I'm in a residential district. I have a residential property. Great, I'm perfect. I don't have to worry about zoning laws. Conditional uses are a use that is permitted in a zone only if it meets a certain criteria. So, for example, I'm in a residential area, but now there's somebody wants to build a church or a community center or something like that in that residential area. Well, that's not residential. Nobody lives there, or it's not really technically a living area. It's more of a public area or a community, closer to commercial than residential, is what I'm trying to say. So, but it might be permitted in that zone if it meets some criteria, like setback, right? So the setback is how far back you can build between the lot line and a structure, right? You can't be like right on top of somebody. You might, if you live in the city or if you've been to the city, some of those, there's not a big setback, and some of those buildings are inches away from each other. If there's, they might want sufficient parking because you don't want to clog up the streets with people parking on the street every Sunday when they're going to church. Noise limits, hours of operation, things like they might require buffering. So, like if you've probably seen require the fences when you're on the highway, right? You have those big fences that are like sound shields to help residents not hear all of the noise from a big parkway or a highway that goes alongside their house, or maybe landscaping or fences or something like that. um, they might A conditional use might be an accessory use. So you have a home, but then you have a home office, or you have a funeral home and you live above there or something like that. So your main use might be a house, but then maybe there's an accessory use. So those are conditional uses in a zone. So I kind of think that the church in a residential area is kind of the best example of that. And you get, as long as you meet the conditions, you should be able to, you would be permitted to have that property in that zone. Um, Obviously, you have to fill out an application and things like that. Non-conforming. I think of the non-conforming uses as grandfathered. Okay, so this was here before the zoning restrictions were put into force. Okay, and they don't comply with those restrictions. Okay, so I had a mom and pop grocery store, and then all of a sudden now this whole area is residentially zoned, and so I'm non-conforming. Now usually the non-conforming uses are grandfathered in. Okay, so you don't lose the value of that commercial enterprise in the residential zone. You have a vested right. You have a right to use that because you purchased that property and used that property in a certain way before these restrictions came into play. But usually with non-conforming uses, you can't say like, oh, I'm gonna like make a new parking lot, or I'm gonna like expand, or I'm going to put like a crazy new sign on something like that, right? So if you want to expand or change a non-conforming use, it's really, really kind of hard to do. The municipality is usually more interested in the conforming use as it evolves, becoming more conforming, not less conforming. Um, Zoning ordinances might also regulate if you want to subdivide a land. So, say I have a big horse farm and I want to sell it and subdivide it, I would have to go to the zoning ordinances to make sure I am doing this properly, this subdivision of land. Okay, so this is zoning. And these things are all these terms will all be on the quiz. Okay, another term that we talk about, and I kind of went off. I didn't really like the order that it had in the book because I wanted to go through zoning before we went to the comprehensive plan. So a comprehensive plan. So I am like, chartering a town and I want it to be like the perfect town. I come up with this plan for the community as it is and give way and kind of take into account its future development. Okay, so we research it well. We have community input, what they like, what they want from their town, um, and careful planning helps promote sustainable development. Okay, so then we don't overtax the sewer system, we don't overtax the electrical grid, we maybe set aside parkland and green space and limit industrial uses, either maybe close to schools or parks or power lines and things like that. um, so that's something when you're doing your comprehensive plan, you want to help to promote sustainable development. um, if you do any zoning that is arbitrary, right, that's kind of not in your comprehensive plan, um, that might be held to be invalid and it might not be enforceable. So if we have again this residential district and then all of a sudden the richest family in town gets a zoning allowance to put a supermarket in there, um, that can be held to be arbitrary and unenforceable. Okay, so that would be an island of a different, a spot zoning, just like a little island of different use. So not something that's been grandfathered, a new use. So if they're only allowing one little bit, and it might be somebody who has some influence or money, that might be held to be arbitrary. So when you're doing your comprehensive plan, it's not just about zoning. You have to think about, okay, do we have enough roads to get everybody in and out, and where will the roads go? And the sewer system and the water system. Transportation. Do we need buses? Do we need trains? Do we need sidewalks? Um, Services like, all right, if we're building a whole, 100 new homes, maybe we need to increase the amount of seats in a school because presumably some of those people will have children. We're going to have more, it's going to be taxing the fire department and the police department more, the more people you have. You want to have green space, and then maybe you want some space for affordable housing, and then you also want spots for economic development. And yeah, you need a grocery store and a hardware store and some restaurants and things like that. So your comprehensive plan is not just about zoning. It's kind of about like, where do you want your town to go? Um, so I did attach again on the supplemental materials, the Illinois comprehensive plan statute, which kind of gives everybody, all municipalities, kind of like a guideline for how to, right, and power to create their own comprehensive plan. There's also an attached statute on brownfields development, and we talked a little bit about brownfields a few weeks back. And I wanted to, because we talk about it, I've talked about it a couple of times, but never really told you about brownfields. So I did attach in the supplemental materials just a link to the Wikipedia description on brownfields. So brownfields are basically like already developed uses or places that are not currently being used. So say you have like, an abandoned factory. Okay. So that's, think of like, okay, it's not like a green field, it's a brown field. And sometimes, a lot of times, brownfields have a potential for being unclean, right? Having some sort of uh, environmental issues, some cleanup needed. So a lot of states enact programs to encourage redevelopment of these brownfields, right? Cleaning up and putting something else there. Otherwise, it's just, devastated land. So that was just something in the textbook. They suggested that you guys take a look at our local statute on brownfields. And that's, I'm telling you what brownfields are. Um, also, there's a link to the Aurora zoning section of the Code of Ordinances if you wanted to look through that. Um, and, check through it and look for our planning, conditional use, and non-conforming use, which actually gets me to our classwork. I'm going to stop this here, but the first part of our classwork is researching your area, your town, your city, your village, and looking at their zoning laws. And, you know, how do you get this is a conditional use? How do you apply for conditional use in wherever you live? I just linked a couple of areas, a couple of cities or villages in the Wabansie area for in case they're one of yours. If not, you can just Google your town, your town and code of ordinances, and it should be on your town website. If you can't find that, you can use one of those. So what I want you to do is, look through the local ordinances, find conditional use and application process, and just give me like a paragraph on what the process is. How do you apply? Who reviews it? What are some of the conditions? So that is your classwork. I'm going to stop this here so you can work at that, and then I'll chat with you later in our next video.